They weren't supposed to be there. That was the first thought in the minds of many German officers when they found them. Women, armed, in uniform, standing over the bodies of the dead. Soviet snipers, Soviet gunners, Soviet pilots who dropped bombs in the night and disappeared before a searchlight could touch them. These weren't nurses. They weren't medics. They were warriors. And for the Nazi regime, that was a problem far deeper than tactics. It was an existential contradiction, a threat not only to the front lines, but to the entire ideological foundation of the Third Reich. You see, to the Nazis, war was the domain of men. Women were mothers, homemakers, the biological engine of the Aryan future. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. That was their role, their only role. So when German troops encountered Soviet women fighting, shooting, commanding, it wasn't just shocking, it was intolerable. It shattered their worldview. And in war, when ideology is threatened, brutality becomes a response, a reflex, a policy. The German High Command didn't just react to the presence of armed women with discomfort. They responded with orders, coded language that made the intention unmistakable: capture no one, offer no quarter, shoot them all. These weren't battlefield accidents. These were executions. Soviet women, when captured, were rarely given the protections of the Geneva Convention. In many cases, they weren't even registered as prisoners of war. They were shot in ditches, hung, tortured, disposed of like trash. The logic behind this horror wasn't tactical. It was ideological. Because to the Nazis, a Soviet woman with a rifle was more than an enemy. She was an aberration, a walking violation of racial and gendered order. She was not supposed to exist, and so she had to be erased. But the story doesn't start with her death. It starts with her defiance. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army was hemorrhaging men. The front lines stretched for thousands of kilometers. Losses were catastrophic. Desperate measures were required, and the Soviet leadership turned to a resource that few nations had ever dared to consider in combat: women. And they didn't just serve. They fought. Snipers, pilots, partisans, anti-aircraft gunners, machine gunners, radio operators in frontline bunkers, tank commanders, engineers, medics who carried rifles, scouts who carried knives. They fought in the forests, in the trenches, on rooftops. They served not as decoration, but as equals, as soldiers. Women like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, credited with over 300 confirmed sniper shots. Women like the pilots of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the infamous night witches who flew under the cover of darkness, cutting their engines mid-flight to glide silently before striking. They were fast, inventive, and deadly. And worst of all, for the Nazis, they were living proof that the Reich's gender orthodoxy was a lie. That's why they were targeted so ruthlessly. It wasn't just revenge. It wasn't just battlefield rage. It was a system. German commanders circulated orders. Female partisans are to be treated with the utmost suspicion. Women captured in possession of weapons are to be executed immediately. These were not rogue actions. They were doctrine, unwritten law at first, later formalized in orders from officers like General von Reichenau, whose severity order justified mass executions of civilians and irregulars, including women, under the guise of anti-partisan warfare. Captured Soviet women weren't treated like soldiers. They were stripped, violated, interrogated, their uniforms mocked, their medals torn off, their bodies defiled, and then they were shot, not because they posed a threat, but because their very presence humiliated the enemy. The propaganda machine amplified the hatred. Nazi posters depicted Soviet female fighters as monstrous. They were shown stabbing babies, seducing and corrupting, carrying diseases. The goal wasn't just to justify shooting them, it was to dehumanize them so thoroughly that no soldier would hesitate, because hesitation was dangerous. A soldier who hesitated might start to wonder, might start to question, how could a woman be this brave, this skilled, this unbreakable? The answer had to be she was not human. Anything else threatened the foundation of Nazi ideology, and that's the key to understanding why they were shot again and again. Because if you admitted she was a soldier, you had to admit your worldview was wrong. You had to admit that Soviet women weren't weak, that gender wasn't destiny, that courage, resolve, and strength weren't exclusive to the Aryan male. The Nazis couldn't accept that, so they pulled the trigger, again and again. But that wasn't the end, because Soviet women knew what awaited them in German hands, and they adapted. They fought harder, refused capture, dug in with sniper partners. Some even detonated grenades when surrounded, taking their own lives and the enemy's with them. Others survived by wit, not just weapon. Some hid their roles, claimed to be nurses or cooks. Some played dead, others used skills, medical, linguistic, technical, to make themselves temporarily useful, delaying execution long enough to escape, to outlive the regime that wanted them erased. Their resistance wasn't just physical, it was ideological, and that made them dangerous in ways no man ever could be. That's why they were hunted. And yet, the betrayal did not end with the war. The survivors, those rare few who endured the front, the prisons, the camps, returned home to suspicion. In Stalin's USSR, being captured was a black mark. Better to die than surrender, the saying went, and so even those who had resisted with every breath found themselves accused of weakness, of compromise, even of treason. They were interrogated, watched, sometimes exiled, rarely honored. Their heroism was inconvenient, their trauma buried. The Soviet Union loved martyrs, dead women who could be put on stamps. Living ones, especially those who had survived Nazi captivity, were harder to celebrate. And so silence fell, not from weakness, but from betrayal. They had defied two monsters and survived them both. But the cost was visibility. The cost was voice. Only now, decades later, do we start to tell their stories in full. Not as legends, not as symbols, but as people. People who picked up rifles when no one expected them to. People who held the line when others fell. People who were hunted for what they represented, not just as enemies, but as proof that even war could not confine women to the roles the world had written for them. And that is why they were shot. Because they fought. Because they dared. Because they made the enemy feel small, fragile, and false. They weren't supposed to be there, but they were. And they never backed down. They were supposed to stay behind the lines. In factories, hospitals, kitchens. That was the expectation, the unwritten law of every army before the war tore those laws apart. The Germans certainly believed it. They built their entire war machine around it. Soldiers at the front, women at the hearth, strength in steel, purity in blood, obedience in gender. And yet, from the moment the Red Army shattered that paradigm, everything changed. Because Soviet women didn't stay behind, they advanced. They crawled through the mud with Mosin Nagants. They flew ancient biplanes over enemy lines. They operated heavy machine guns, radioed artillery fire, lobbed grenades in close-quarters trench brawls. They didn't just support the war, they embodied it, carried it on their backs, fired it from their rifles. That kind of defiance wasn't just shocking to the Wehrmacht, it was humiliating. For a regime that taught its soldiers that Slavs were racially inferior, that women were to be protected, or dominated the sight of a Soviet woman in uniform, aiming with precision, shooting with cold resolve, it was unbearable. And the rage that followed wasn't just strategic, it was personal. Reports from the front show it, captured documents, testimonies from soldiers, even letters from officers. Again and again you find the same pattern: disbelief followed by disgust, disgust followed by violence. They didn't see Soviet women as prisoners. They saw them as a stain to be removed. That's why the bullets came so quickly, why executions were immediate, why entire patrols were dispatched to hunt female snipers with a savagery often worse than what they showed male soldiers. Because those women had crossed a line that Nazi ideology couldn't abide. They had unmade the myth of the superior male warrior. They had defiled what the regime saw as natural. And in war, when your belief system is shaken, you don't reflect, you retaliate. Even when those retaliations become crimes. Especially then. The law was supposed to stop it. The rules of war, the Hague Conventions, the Geneva Accords. Even if the Soviet Union hadn't signed every treaty, the international expectation was clear. Combatants captured in uniform, regardless of gender, were to be treated as prisoners of war. But the Nazis didn't just ignore that standard, they rewrote it. They redefined Soviet women, not as combatants but as partisans, saboteurs, terrorists. They stripped them of status before they ever stripped their uniforms. The moment a woman was found with a weapon, she was an enemy without rights. That legal fiction gave cover to everything that followed. A sniper could be executed on the spot. A pilot could be hanged. A radio operator tortured, raped, discarded. And in each case, the excuse would be the same: not a soldier, not protected, not human. Just another threat to the Reich. And still the women fought. Because they knew what capture meant. They knew what happened when you laid down your rifle, what happened when you fell into German hands. So they didn't lay down. They fought to the last. They carried cyanide capsules. They turned their last bullets inward. They aimed their bodies like weapons, refusing to let the enemy define their end. There's a reason Soviet commanders didn't need to lecture these women about courage. They had already chosen death over subjugation. Because what the Nazis never understood, what terrified them more than the bullets or the bombs, was that these women were not anomalies. They were not exceptions. They were the consequence of something larger. A system that believed, however imperfectly, that in times of existential threat, gender was secondary to survival. And so the Soviets mobilized them not because they were expendable, but because they were necessary. The German soldiers wrote about it in their journals. They called them demonic, unwomanly, monstrous, because they could not explain what they saw through their own ideology. How could women be such effective soldiers? How could they endure the same horror, fight through the same fire, and still advance? It violated every rule the Third Reich held sacred, and violations in the Nazi system demanded extermination. So they shot them, again and again, in forests, in ditches, behind barns, in front of their comrades, in silence. Some were executed publicly to send a message. Others were shot in secret to hide the shame of having been bested. But none were forgotten, because the survivors carried them, not just in memory, but in every act of resistance. Every sniper who chose a new position after each shot, every pilot who returned to base without landing lights gliding low over German lines, every machine gunner who waited for the second wave before pulling the trigger. They carried not just vengeance but defiance. Because for all the bullets, all the orders, all the propaganda, the Nazis couldn't erase them. couldn't erase Lyudmila Pavlichenko's 309 confirmed hits, couldn't erase the 30,000 sorties flown by the night witches, couldn't erase the line held by a mortar unit of 20 women who repelled 3 German assaults in a single night, couldn't erase the dozens who became posthumous heroes of the Soviet Union, buried with honors, medals clutched in burned hands. And though the war ended, though the guns fell silent, that silence was not peace. Not for the women who returned. Not for those who had survived prison camps, survived execution orders, survived interrogation and starvation. They came home not to parades, but to suspicion, because under Stalin, capture was not misfortune. It was betrayal. The NKVD questioned them, watched them. Some were jailed, others were sent to remote regions, forbidden from speaking of what they'd done, what they'd endured, because the state wanted martyrs, not survivors. And women who had fought and returned were too complicated. They couldn't be romanticized without breaking the myth. So they were silenced. The war had used them, and the peace discarded them. But they remembered, in diaries, in whispered stories, in scars. They remembered the face of the German officer who pulled the trigger. They remembered the friends who didn't come back. They remembered what it felt like to be a soldier in a world that refused to see them as one. That memory is their legacy, and that's why we tell their story now. Not just to honor them, but to understand the war through their eyes. To understand how ideology doesn't just define who we fight, it defines who we fear. And Nazi Germany feared them, not because they were monsters, but because they were proof that women could fight, could end lives, could stand toe-to-toe with the myth of Aryan supremacy and put a bullet through its heart. That's why the Germans shot them, because they could not believe in a world where a woman could be stronger than their lies. But belief never mattered to those women. Only resistance did, and resistance was what they gave, until the very end. They didn't ask to be heroes. They didn't grow up dreaming of war, of crawling through forests in winter with frostbitten hands wrapped around rifle stocks. Most of them were students, clerks, farmers' daughters, women who had memorized poetry, danced in schoolyards, whispered to sweethearts beneath trees before the world turned black with fire. But when the Germans came, when the skies filled with bombers and the trains rolled west with tanks and death, the question was never, will you fight? The question was, how could you not? And so they volunteered, by the tens of thousands. Not because they wanted vengeance, though many did, but because they saw their country bleeding, their families erased, their cities flattened, and in that moment, gender meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was resistance. The Soviet system, for all its brutal flaws, made space for that resistance. It had long trained women in military basics, rifle clubs, aviation circles, engineering institutes. When war erupted, it simply flipped the switch. The women were already there, already qualified, already angry, and that rage was focused, sharpened, deployed. Some signed up for the Sniper Corps, where discipline was fanatical and precision meant survival. Others joined the infantry, dug foxholes, braved machine gun fire. Others still took to the skies in planes that were barely more than plywood and canvas, dropping bombs on German supply lines under the cover of night. The Germans had no frame of reference for this. In their world, a woman's worth was measured by fertility, by obedience, by how well she could raise the next generation of soldiers, not fight them. And now those same women were blowing up convoys, assassinating officers, luring patrols into traps and wiping them out with grenades. It was a perversion, they said. It was an abomination. But deep down, what they really meant was it was effective. That's what terrified them most. Because once you acknowledge that women can be as deadly as men, as brave, as strategic, as relentless, what else can they be? What other lies must be questioned? The entire Nazi ideology began to unravel the moment a young Soviet woman dropped into a firing position and eliminated a high-ranking officer at 400 meters with a single shot. It wasn't just a bullet through a man. It was a bullet through a myth. That myth of male supremacy, of the righteous German warrior, of the weak Slavic woman, died 1,000 deaths on the Eastern Front. It died in the snows outside Stalingrad when female machine gunners held the line until reinforcements arrived. It died on the night witches dropped their bombs and disappeared before German flak could find them. It died when captured women, bloodied and beaten, looked their executioners in the eye and said nothing. No plea, no mercy, just defiance. That's what the bullets were for. Not justice, not order, erasure. Because if they could be silenced, they could be forgotten. And if they were forgotten, the lie could survive. But history has a way of remembering what regimes try to erase. Because even in death, they left traces, witnesses, reports, orders stamped with signatures, execution sites where bones were later uncovered, stories smuggled home in whispers and letters hidden beneath floorboards, in photographs with names scratched on the back. Some of the women were recovered, some were never found. Some were buried in mass graves, some were honored with medals, some with silence. But all of them, in one way or another, became part of something greater than war. They became proof that courage is not defined by gender, that loyalty, sacrifice, and resistance are not the property of men, that the battlefield makes no distinction between male and female when the bullets fly, but the regimes do. And that's why the German response was so brutal, because this wasn't just a war of territory, it was a war of meaning, of values, of ideology. And in that war, the presence of Soviet women was a direct assault on everything the Nazis believed. They didn't just shoot them to win battles. They shot them to protect a belief system, a belief that was collapsing tank by tank, trench by trench, sniper shot by sniper shot. And when the war was finally over, when Berlin fell and the swastika was torn down, the world began to tally the cost. Tens of millions dead, cities turned to ash, nations redrawn. But amid that reckoning, the women who had fought so fiercely found themselves pushed to the margins. Not by the enemy, but by their own side. The Soviet Union, triumphant and wounded, did not know how to honor its female soldiers. There were parades, there were medals, but there was also silence, questions, suspicion. Why were you captured? What did you do in those camps? What did the Germans learn from you? The same women who had stared down Nazi officers now sat in interrogation rooms defending their own patriotism, their loyalty, their dignity. And many of them never spoke of the war again. They returned to civilian life, married, raised children, worked in factories, taught in schools. But the war never left them. It lingered in their bones, in the scars on their hands, in the dreams that made them wake up, kill gasping, in the way they flinched at sudden noises, in the way they walked with the bearing of soldiers who knew what it meant to lose everything and fight anyway. Their stories were passed down in fragments. A look, a phrase, a medal tucked away in a drawer. And now we are piecing those fragments back together. We are remembering them not just as symbols, but as soldiers. Not as footnotes, but as front lines. And we are finally asking the question that should have been asked long ago. Why were they killed? The answer is simple. They were killed because they shattered illusions. Because they refused to stay in their place. Because they picked up rifles and said, "You will not take my home without a fight." Because they fought like hell. Because they were women, and because that made their resistance even more dangerous. Because the enemy knew that if they let them live, more would follow. And they were right. Because even now, decades later, their legacy burns. In every woman who trains to fight. In every story told of sniper duels and bomber raids and last stands. In every act of remembrance that says, "We see you, we remember. You were soldiers. You didn't instead ask to be heroes, but you became them anyway. And no bullet can erase that. There is something eternal in defiance." The Soviet women who stood on the front lines of the Second World War did not inherit power. They claimed it. They did not ask to be written into history. They forced history to reckon with them. And still, for decades, they remained shadows, hints in textbooks, footnotes in military ledgers. Their names were remembered in family circles, whispered with reverence or grief, but rarely spoken aloud in public halls. Because the world, even in peace, has always been slow to accept that women could go to war and return unchanged, or refuse to be broken at all. But they did. They went to war not with illusions, but with intent. They knew the cost. They saw the fallen comrades, the smoking tanks, the shattered villages. They knew the risks of capture, knew the execution orders, knew that Nazi bullets didn't discriminate between sniper and saboteur. If you wore a Soviet uniform and held a weapon, you were marked for death. And still they went. What kind of courage does that take? What kind of fury fuels a person to crawl through the mud at night with frostbitten fingers, to sit for hours unmoving behind a scope waiting for the right moment, knowing every shot you take brings the enemy closer to finding you? What kind of heart do you need to fly missions every night in planes with no armor, no radios, and only the moonlight to guide you? These women were not symbols. They were not myth. They were flesh and blood, exhausted and freezing, terrified and relentless. They had their own doubts, their own fears, but they carried them into combat like any soldier. They did not crumble, even when the system around them tried to pretend they hadn't been there. When the war ended, the Soviet Union exalted its victory but grew silent about its women warriors. The story of the Red Army was simplified, sculpted, mythologized into statues of male sacrifice. The thousands of women who had carried rifles, flown bombers, and dug trenches were gently nudged off stage. Their medals were real, but their stories were not welcome. Some were quietly dismissed from military roles, others were denied benefits given to their male counterparts, and the cruelest irony, those who had survived German captivity were labeled unreliable, traitors even, because to have been captured was to have failed, because the idea that a woman could fight, be taken prisoner, and not betray her country was simply too complicated for Stalin's bureaucratic machinery. So they lived on, in silence, in the margins. Some married and never spoke of what they had done. Others became teachers, doctors, engineers. But always there was the shadow of war, not just in their memories, but in how the world viewed them, with suspicion, with discomfort, with disbelief. And that silence was a second battlefield, because forgetting can be a form of erasure, a quieter, slower death. And yet, despite the silence, they endured. You see, courage is not just measured in combat, it is measured in how you live after. And they lived, with scars. Yes, with grief, always, but also with the knowledge that they had stood in the face of one of the most terrifying war machines the world had ever seen, and held the line. They knew what they had done, even if no one asked. Even if the archives were sealed and the medals kept in drawers and their names left off the monuments, they knew. Some wrote their stories, years later, memoirs printed in small runs, oral histories recorded in secret. Others were rediscovered by grandchildren who found medals buried in trunks or journals, tucked behind walls. Piece by piece, their voices returned. And with those voices came a reckoning, because the question was never whether they had the right to fight. The question was, why had we refused to see them? Why had we accepted the narrative that war is only a man's burden? Why had we let their deaths go uncounted, their names unspoken, their courage unmatched? The truth is, because they were inconvenient. Not because they were weak, but because they were too strong. They upended everything. Their presence forced us to reconsider what war demands and what it reveals. And it revealed this: that when the world is on fire, when your home is invaded, when your people are being slaughtered, courage has no gender. That when faced with annihilation, a woman with a rifle is not a miracle. She is an inevitability. You don't fight fascism by asking it politely to leave. You fight it by loading the rifle, by aiming through the scope, by flying through the darkness, engine humming, bombs primed, heart steady. That sets what they did. That sits why the Germans hated them. Because they were not symbols of a broken nation, they were evidence of its will to survive. That sits why they were shot. Because they proved the lie of Nazi superiority, because their courage exposed the cowardice behind ideology, because their resistance, their very existence, was a threat to a system built on dehumanization. And every time they fought back, every time they survived, every time they pulled the trigger, they cracked that system just a little more. The final tragedy was that their own country couldn't always recognize what they had done. But perhaps now, finally, we can. We can tell their stories not as novelties, but as essential chapters in the history of resistance. We can learn from their tactics, their sacrifice, their endurance. We can remember them not as victims, but as warriors. Because the war did not define them. They defined the war. In the frozen woods, in the bombed-out cities, in the skies over burning railways, in the silence of a sniper's breath before the shot, and in the long years after, when they carried their pain with dignity and their memories with pride. Let us carry them now, not with pity, but with honor. They weren't supposed to survive, not because they lacked skill, not because they lacked courage, but because the world had never made space for women who returned from war still holding the weight of it in their bones. The Germans tried to erase them with bullets. The Soviets tried to forget them with silence. But they lived. They lived with frostbite scarring their fingers, with shrapnel still lodged beneath the skin. They lived with dreams of battlefields that returned each night, with the sound of boots in hallways that made them freeze mid-step. They lived with names of comrades lost in snow, of sisters buried in mass graves, of units scattered and never found again. And they lived knowing that the hardest part of the war was not the front line, but coming home. Because home was not what they remembered. Home did not understand the language of war. It did not understand women who no longer wept easily, who could field strip a rifle in the dark, who had memorized the sound of artillery by caliber and distance. They had been forged into steel by necessity, and the world wanted them soft again. Some tried. They married, raised children, returned to sewing, nursing, teaching. But the war never left them. Not really. It lingered in the way they listened, the way they watched, the way they stood just a little differently when someone entered a room. They had been commanders, warriors, assassins, and now they were expected to pretend. But you can instead unlearn war. You can only carry it differently. So they did. Quietly, carefully, with a kind of strength no parade ever celebrated. There were no banners for them, no memorials, no epic statues carved in stone, just the knowledge buried deep that once, when the world stood on the brink, they held the line. They were there in the fields of Kursk, hunkered down between shell craters, whispering instructions through grit and fear. They were there on the banks of the Volga, bleeding and still firing. They were there behind enemy lines, transmitting coded messages to Soviet HQ, while knowing that every second the radio stayed on increased the chance of detection. They were everywhere. And yet after the war they were nowhere. History moved on. The Cold War came. Then detente, then collapse. And still their names remain buried in footnotes. Because their existence complicated the story. It challenged the myth that heroism has a face, square-jawed, male, decorated. It challenged the idea that sacrifice should be sanitized, that pain has a gender, that valor should be neat and knowable. But they weren't sit neat. They weren't sit knowable. They were women who had watched friends die in pieces. Women who had bled out in the snow and screamed until their lungs tore. Women who had chosen to fight, not because they were allowed to, but because they had no other choice. That choice made them dangerous, not to the enemy but to memory itself. Because the truth is, every empire constructs its own myth, and in those myths, women are symbols, innocents, victims, nurses with soft eyes and steady hands, not warriors, not marksmen, not the ones who held the last line of defense with grenades strapped to their bodies. But the women of the Red Army were all those things, and more. They didn't just shoot Nazis. They shot the lie that courage belongs to one gender, and still they were forgotten. Some faded into obscurity. Others were erased outright. Those who had died were honored only in whispers, their medals awarded posthumously, their names entered into ledgers no one read. And yet some of them endured long enough to see recognition return. In the late years, as the Soviet Union fractured and memories were no longer dangerous, their stories began to surface again. Journals were published, interviews aired on state television, documentaries sought them out, and people listened, stunned, disbelieving, not because they doubted the facts, but because they had never imagined them. Because no one had told them that the most feared sniper in the Soviet army was a woman, that a teenage girl had flown over 800 bombing missions in a plane made of plywood and canvas, that female scouts had crawled through minefields at night to capture enemy positions and return with intelligence critical to entire offensives, that mothers, daughters, sisters had stood in trenches and fought with a fury born not of ideology, but of love, love for their land, for their people, for a future they knew they might never live to see. This was instead idealism. It was instead propaganda. It was survival, and in that survival they became something else. Symbols, yes, but not the kind the world expected. They weren't poster girls. They were warnings. Proof that if you push people far enough, if you burn their villages, shoot their families, desecrate their homes, they will fight back. All of them. Even the ones you think are powerless, especially them. And maybe that's the most enduring legacy of those women. Not just that they fought, but that they rewrote the terms of war itself. They proved that the battlefield has no owner, that strength has no gender, that in the face of annihilation, human beings will resist with whatever they have, whether it sets a rifle, or a radio, or a torn boot and a sharpened knife. And that resistance, it changes everything. It changed the outcome of battles. It changed the morale of armies. It changed the fabric of history. Because when a woman stands up in the rubble and refuses to run, refuses to hide, refuses to die without a fight, that defiance ripples through time. It dares the future to remember her. And so we do. We remember her not as a relic, not as a novelty, but as a soldier, a warrior, a truth. She was not supposed to be there. But she was, and she stayed, until the very end. Her boots were too big, her rifle too long for her shoulders, the uniform itched, and the helmet kept sliding down her brow. She was 18, maybe 19, no more than a girl, but the war didn't stat care. It didn't ask her age, it didn't ask if she was ready. It simply arrived on the wind, in the bombs, in the silence, after a telegram. And she answered, not with words, not with protest, but by stepping forward, by taking the rifle, by vanishing into the ranks. This is how it began for so many Soviet women, not as a grand act of rebellion, not as a call to fame, but as a decision made in the shadow of death. Fathers gone, brothers lost, villages turned to ash. What else was there to do? So they trained, they adapted, they hardened. They became snipers, pilots, partisans, learned to move like ghosts, shoot like shadows, learned the art of camouflage, the anatomy of fear, the weight of a man's body when you drag him from the field with bullets snapping past your head. They learned to use a gun, not because they wanted to, but because the enemy left no other option. And once they started shooting, the enemy never forgot. German reports began to include their presence early in the Eastern Campaign. Unnatural, fanatical, savage. The words shifted from disbelief to contempt, from contempt to fear. Fear hardened into hatred. Hatred birthed orders. No quarter, no mercy. The logic was simple. If you catch a woman with a weapon, execute her. If you find one in uniform, shoot her. If you suspect she's a partisan, hang her, burn her, make her an example. Because every one of them was an affront to German supremacy, to Nazi order, to male dominance. These women weren't breaking rules, they were unmaking them. Every bullet they fired, every mission they flew, every radio they operated rewrote the narrative, redefined what was possible, what was necessary. The Nazis couldn't allow that. Their worldview depended on hierarchy, on control, on defining who could fight and who could only scream. So they made sure that captured Soviet women didn't live to tell the tale. But some did. Not many, but enough. And their stories are not just survival narratives, they are indictments, testimonies of torture, of deliberate, systematic annihilation. In camps like Ravensbrück, female Soviet prisoners were segregated, starved, beaten, used in experiments, labeled subhuman, not just for being Slavic, not just for being Soviet, but for the deeper crime of having resisted. Some died in those camps. Others escaped. Still others were liberated, only to be interrogated by their own government, branded as suspicious, untrustworthy, tainted by captivity. Imagine that. You survive Hitler, and Stalin questions your loyalty. You return home not to parades, but to closed doors, to friends who don't ask what happened, to comrades who avert their eyes, to silence, thick and permanent. So you lock it away, the memories, the pain, the truth. You move on. You marry, or don't stut. You work, or disappear. But every year on Victory Day you stand in the crowd as the tanks roll by and you remember. You remember the sound of a Mosin Nagant bolt sliding forward. You remember the cold before the assault. You remember the names Galina, Marina, Zoya. Women who never came home. Women whose faces you still see in the smoke. And in those moments the war is not history. It is not glory. It is not even past. It is presence. It is heartbeat. It is breath. You know this because you lived it. And no one, not time, not politics, not propaganda, can take that from you. That's the tragedy and the triumph of these women. They were erased in so many ways. They were written out of textbooks, ignored in speeches, omitted from monuments, but they endured. Their legacy exists not in what was said, but in what was done. In every mission completed, in every line held, in every act of defiance that made the enemy recoil and the world take notice. Even now, decades later, when most of them are gone, their presence lingers. In the photographs, sepia-toned, folded at the corners, women in uniform with hard eyes and slight smiles. In the diaries written in shorthand tucked beneath floorboards, recovered long after the last battle. In the medals, small, dusty, hanging from bedroom walls with ribbons that have faded to rust red. And in the voices recorded late in life, trembling but firm. I fought. That sips all they say, sometimes. Not how, not where, just that. I fought. And it sets enough. Because that statement breaks centuries of silence. It slices through the assumption that women only waited, wept, or worked behind the lines. It says, I was there. I saw it. I did what had to be done. And in doing so, I changed everything. That is the quiet revolution these women launched. A revolution of presence, of refusal, of standing where the world said they had no right to stand. With a rifle, with a bomb, with a bandaged comrade slung over their shoulder. They shattered the myth that war is a man's world, and they paid dearly for it. They were hunted, executed, silenced, but not broken, never broken, because every time they fired a shot, they reclaimed a piece of themselves. Every time they survived, they carved their names into a wall the world had tried to build without them. And though the world took too long to see them, to honor them, to tell their stories, it is not too late. It is never too late. Because they are not gone. Not really. They are the echo in every woman who picks up a burden not meant for her and carries it anyway. They are the memory in every resistance movement that says, we do not need your permission to fight. They are the proof that when the worst comes, courage does not ask what's in your pants. It only asks, will you stand? They stood, and they still do. In story, in legacy, in truth. They didn't survive to be thanked, but they damn well deserved to be remembered. She remembered the moment the uniform was handed to her. Stiff fabric, rough seams, a cap that didn't quite fit. There was no ceremony, no speech, just an officer glancing at a roster, nodding once, and telling her she was now part of the Red Army. A soldier. She wasn't ready. None of them were. Not really. But readiness wasn't a requirement anymore. Not when your country was burning, cities gone, families buried under rubble, the front collapsing. You didn't have time to ask whether you were prepared. You only asked where they needed you most. And they needed her with a rifle. It was a different kind of war on the Eastern Front. Not just one of machines and maps, but of ideology, of annihilation. The Germans didn't come to conquer. They came to cleanse. They didn't see soldiers in Soviet uniforms. They saw targets, subhumans, obstacles to the new order. And when they saw women in those uniforms, fighting, leading, they saw something even worse. They saw defiance. Women like her didn't just fight the enemy. They offended him. They offended him. Their presence shattered every assumption the Reich held sacred. The belief that women were too weak, too gentle, too inferior to stand toe-to-toe with a Wehrmacht patrol and win. But she did. Many did. Snipers concealed in the brush, waiting patiently, motionless for hours. Machine gunners directing fire against armored advances. Combat medics under artillery barrage, dragging wounded men out of kill zones and returning for more. Each woman was a rejection of the myth. Each bullet fired a declaration that gender would not be a shield or a cage. And because they refused to be silent, the Germans responded with brutality. Captured Soviet women weren't just shot, they were erased, removed from records, executed in forests, ditches, back alleys. Some were tortured first, some were used as propaganda before being discarded. A reminder to others, this is what happens when you defy us. But defiance isn't so easily broken. Because even when they knew what awaited them, they kept going. Even when the enemy whispered in leaflets, "Surrender, girl, and we will spare you," they held fast. They buried cyanide pills in the linings of their coats. They hid one last round in their pistol chambers. Not for the enemy, but for themselves, should the moment come when there was no other escape. And that wasn't set weakness. That wasn't set despair. It was control. It was resistance to the very last breath. Some of them lived. They were captured, interrogated, locked in cages, survivors of something almost no one understood. When the camps were liberated, their condition was unrecognizable. Bodies starved, but eyes still sharp. They didn't speak of what had been done to them. They didn't have to. You could see it in their silence. But when they returned home, they were greeted not with celebration, but suspicion. Because in Stalin's world, survival could mean collaboration. Being taken alive wasn't a testament to endurance. It was a question mark over your loyalty, your purity, your trustworthiness. Some were interrogated again, by their own people this time. Some were reassigned to distant outposts, stripped of rank, forced to rebuild lives from the shadows. Not enemies, but not heroes either. Just inconvenient reminders of a past the state didn't want to explain. So they adapted. Again. The same way they had adapted in battle, shifting roles, hiding pain, finding strength. Where others only saw weakness, they lived small lives, quiet lives, but inside they carried something vast. Memory. Memory of what they said seen, what they said done, who they stets lost. And while the world moved on, wars ended, borders shifted, ideologies crumbled, they carried that war like a second skin. Sometimes they spoke of it, but rarely. The words were too heavy, the audience too unsure. Who would believe them? That a girl from Smolensk had crawled through the ruins of Stalingrad with 2 grenades and a rusted submachine gun? That she had once shot 3 German officers in the span of a minute? That she'd survived a winter with no boots, only rags, but refused to leave her post? They didn't want pity. They didn't need validation. What they wanted was simpler. To be remembered. Accurately. Completely. Not as martyrs, not as mascots. As soldiers. The West took longer to understand. Western armies had kept women away from combat, cloaked in protection that was really exclusion. They spoke of bravery while denying women the right to prove it. But the Soviet women had already proved it. And when their stories began to leak through the cracks, through memoirs, declassified files, aging veterans willing to speak, those stories changed the narrative. Historians started paying attention. Students too. What had once been seen as an anomaly, the Soviet female soldier, was now a crucial chapter in the global history of warfare. Their tactics were studied, their endurance praised. Their innovations, especially in sniper warfare and night bombing, were acknowledged as groundbreaking. They had become teachers again, but this time of truth. Because their story wasn't just about World War II. It was about what war reveals. It strips away pretense. It exposes who's willing to fight, to suffer, to lead. And when you see who steps up when everything falls apart, you begin to question every assumption society has ever made. The Germans learned that too late. They learned it in the forests of Belarus, where female partisans led sabotage missions that derailed entire divisions. They learned it in the skies over the Caucasus, when women in ancient biplanes dropped bombs in perfect silence and disappeared into the dark. They learned it in interrogation rooms when the women they'd tried to break met their eyes and said nothing, because even silence can be defiance. And we are still learning. Every generation that hears their story anew learns something about strength, about endurance, about the cost of survival, and the price of forgetting. Because forgetting is easy. Memory is hard. It requires discomfort. It demands honesty. It shatters illusions. But if we are to understand war not just as strategy but as human experience, we must include them, not as accessories, not as afterthoughts, as central figures. Because the war would have been lost without them. Not in metaphor. In fact, they held the lines that broke the Wehrmacht's advance. They flew the missions that demoralized elite SS units. They relayed the messages that saved entire battalions. And in doing so, they redefined what a soldier could be, what a woman could be, and what we as a people must never again forget.